The Battle of Navarino. It's just one of those battles in one of those wars that gets forgotten. Mainly because it has the misfortune of involving an Allied fleet destroying a Turkish Ottoman fleet, well, an Ottoman Egyptian fleet to be fair, and it takes place outside of one of the major, how do I put this politely, Hollywoodable wars. Yes, if you ever noticed, the wars which are known most about are the ones which Hollywood can turn into a very good movie. Usually some sort of romance, where someone will get injured fighting heroically, then they'll get nursed back to health by someone who is equally attractive, because only attractive people go to war and end up near war, and they're all really, really attractive. And then they'll go on and accomplish something even more heroic and great, and then come back and spend their lives happily ever after with the equally attractive person who nursed them back to health. That pretty much sums up 90% of war movies. And let's be honest, some wars are far more able to be made into a movie than others. Korea should be made into many movies, but I can number the number of Korean War movies that have appeared around the world, not in Korea, on one hand. Vietnam gets lots. World War II gets lots. World War One gets a couple. Zulu Wars got two. Two. Napoleonic Wars pretty much got the Sharp series, Waterloo, a few other picks like that. But most of the other movies, when we're talking about them, they are, well, let's be honest, the Henry V movies that are sort of coming out on Netflix at this current time have probably more to do with Shakespeare than they do with history. But that is the point. There is a lot of history that is not readily, easily, quickly consumed. There is a lot of history which is out there, which is put to one side. So, I give you the Battle of Navarino, which comes from, well, the Greek War of Independence. But let's be honest, it's not really about the Greeks when it's fought. I'm sorry, Greece. There are going to be a lot of people who are probably upset to hear about this. But the reason it's fought is arguably, well, the Russians look like they might come south. The British and French don't want that. I'll get into reasons why they don't want that. And they are trying to intimidate an Egyptian, Turkish Ottoman Egyptian fleet into going home, basically, into stopping what they're doing. And the fleet has, how do I put this politely, lost its French officers, who are not just its support training system, but in many ways its command and control system. And a ship opens fire. Was it ordered to? Was it not ordered to? No one knows. But you have two fleets in close proximity, and a ship opens fire. And it opens fire at the end of its line, struggling with a fire ship which had been launched, and therefore a British frigate was trying to stop that fire ship from getting into the ships of the line, and so a Ottoman vessel opens fire on the British frigate. So the British frigate opens fire on the Ottoman vessel, then a French frigate joins in, then some of the Ottoman corvettes join in, and it goes on and on and on, and you then have the ships of the line engaging each other, and not even all the ships of the line actually engage each other, because some of the actual Turkish, the Ottoman Egyptian sort of vessels, and the reason I'm using Turkish and Ottoman and Egyptian is some of the vessels are very much Ottoman, some of them are from their local Turkish command, and some of them are from their Egyptian vessels. So there is a mixture going on here. Some of them don't even start firing at the same time. So there's actually a whole phase of the battle going on where only half the ships, or ships of the line, i.e. the large frigates which the Ottoman Navy is full of, are actually firing. And don't get me started on the land forts. So it is a really weird confluence of events. And it's something you always have to remember. The British, the ideal dreamed outcome would be the Egyptian army withdrawn from Greece and put into the Black Sea area of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman fleet withdrawn from Greece and in the Black Sea area of the Ottoman Empire, holding up the Russians coming south. Because at certain points there is 100,000 soldier Russian army about to descend on the Ottoman Empire. And that happens in 1828. Fun times. Fun times. The point is, the Battle of Navarino happens because you're having to do increasingly upfront deterrence of conflict to try and stop a conflict in conflict management terms, because not because you actually probably really care about the people who are suffering. Let's be honest. The British and the French governments do not care about the people of Greece. They don't care about the people of Turkey. They don't care about the people of Egypt. They don't care. They care about the peoples of Britain and France. And even those, they only care about the ones who, well, are rich enough to vote. And even they don't really care about all of those, really. Let's be honest. This is what the world is at this time. So, they are coming to fight. Not. They are coming to try and deter conflict. Because the British see the... Let's do this from the British perspective. The Greeks start the War of Independence. It starts off in 1821. They started planning for it in 1814. It starts off a month early because the Ottomans actually managed to work it as spotted after almost 7 years of planning, and actually almost cause it to have trouble. And the Greeks win some things, they lose some things. But by the point of 1827, the Greeks are probably losing. The Ottomans have the advantage of having all the capabilities of even a 19th century state. A corrupt, despotic, very, very badly managed 19th century state, but still they have all the advantages, which means whilst in any war of independence, any civil war, there's always, depressingly so, there are always sections within each faction on both sides who do worse things. There are some people who are honestly fighting for independence, for freedom, for all those things. There are other people who join a cause just because they like to have a reason to kill people. There are always some. People might not like me saying this, but sadly enough, it happens in every single scenario like this. There are going to be probably 85-90% of the people joining it are going to be fighting for honor, for independence, and they're going to hold themselves to a standard and all sorts of things. Then there are going to be the last 10-15%, who are going to be there because they like to cause pain. Okay? They come. They happen. The problem is the scale, because if you're those 10 to 15% and you are the freedom fighters, you do not have the backing of the state. You do not have the census. You do not have the judiciary. You do not have all those things on your side. So you can only achieve a certain amount. You also tend to belong to a slightly more fractious organization, which are more likely, because there's always going to be some of the good people who are going to come and kill you for causing them the trouble. This is one of the things I love about the more recent Star Wars episodes and Star Wars video movies, etc., because they've actually pointed out there are problems within the factions. Not everyone is a good ally to the rebel cause. And some of the people who are theoretically rebels, the rebels themselves would actually quite like to kill because of what they do, because it causes them more trouble than help. And that's the thing. Once you're in a side which deals with violence, that's what you get happening. Where violence is the course of action, expect violence. You're bad enough, though, when they're on that position. When they're on the other side, there is a problem. When they're on the side of the government, with all that beside them, there is nothing really to restrain them. And when they are Ibrahim Pasha, the eldest son of Muhammad Ali Pasha, and he is sent in charge of the Egyptian troops to support the Ottoman Sultanate. Well, life happens badly. So you have the Greek War of Independence. This is what the British and French and the Russians are technically interfering in. But the British and French are there because of the Russians. The Greek War of Independence had, well, they had the very... we often talk about the Hellenistic, societies, and they're arguing for giving support to the Greeks, etc. It just provided a nice cover. It's a nice PR cover for what is essentially a realpolitik move. I'm sorry, there have been many such movements in times. There have been some beautifully organized, beautifully articulated campaigns. If you want a current one, there's the whole Free Tibet movement. They have a very charismatic speaker and leader in the Dalai Lama. They do all the things they do. And yet, does anyone send military force? Nope. Because it's not in anyone's interest to really do that. It's not in anyone's interest. If we consider current scenario in Ukraine, Russia's been beating up countries for years around their borders. Look what they did in 2014 to Ukraine. No one did anything. Now, everyone's supporting Ukraine. Because it's in the interest to support Ukraine. Because of the strategic situation at the moment. Because you've got other scenarios which might cause trouble. It happens. The Greek War of Independence starts off with the Philiki Eteria, Society of Friends, and they have some great leaders, they have some great people they put together. They try their best. They planned to do with the Feast of Annunciation, but they ended up having to go early, and that meant their risings weren't as united as they could be, which gave the Ottomans more abilities to put them down. Because if you have a rising everywhere at the same time, it's far more difficult to put down than it is a rising here, then a rising there, then a rising there, because you can just move the troops around. And if you have no qualms about how much force you use to quash a rising, you can quash a rising. It's not nice, but you can quash it. It won't quash it permanently, but the Ottomans never do long term. They do short term at this point. The Ottomans who did long term are long gone. This is a short term management society. Now, it's a state which is in permanent, not in division or stagnation, it's in permanent turmoil. In many ways, the Ottoman Empire, and from this point onwards, will be propped up more by the British and the French not wanting it to fall than by its own internal competencies. That's a scary thought to think. An empire kept going because of realpolitik, because it was needed to stop the Russians. And here's the point. The Greek War of Independence becomes important internationally because of the Russians. The Russians start moving south. What are the Russians always after as a strategic consideration? Warm water ports with oceanic access. Now, current time, they control not any side of the Straits of Dardanelles. However, the Greek uprising included what we would call, and today Istanbul, at that time was called Constantinople. Because that was part of what Greece was going for. They wanted the entire territories of the Greco area of the Byzantine Empire, but also which had been historically Greek. Those had been historically Greek cities. It's one of the things that people often they put Greek cities in this small area when actually Greece was far larger and had cities dotted all over the place. And so Greece is going for a whole rising. Now, this is the problem, because once they start failing and the Russians suddenly get interested, there becomes a problem. If the Russians get involved, you end up with 3 scenarios. Possibly 4. But there are 3 ones which really are problematic. All 4 are problematic, but, you know. Option 1. The Greeks win, and they become a Russian client state. Option 2. The Greeks win, thanks to the Russian troops, and they become a Russian protectorate. Option 3. The Greeks win and they become part of Russia. Option 4. The Greeks win, the entire Ottoman Empire collapses, and the Russians get control of both sides of the Straits of Dardanelles. Either way, they end up with control of the Straits of Dardanelles, and an empire which was already pretty aggressive and expansionist can expand even further. This is a problem. We're used to thinking about the Anglo-Russian disagreements over Afghanistan and the progression of Russia in the direction of India. But there's also the progression of Russia in the direction of Egypt, of the Middle East, of Eastern Europe, getting closer and closer. The 19th century is the era of great empires, and Russia was there to build it. This is not a good scenario. And the French, and that doesn't work for either the French or the British. Why? For the British, it suddenly creates another threat they have to deal with. For the French, it turns someone into a completely different kettle of fish they have to deal with. These are the 3 great powers of the era: Russia, France, and Britain. In the 19th century, there is no one bigger than those 3. There is no one more powerful than those 3. So, that is what gets involved in the Greek War of Independence. There isn't really an option today for a scenario where you could make an example of it being like it. There is a pair of powers who are quite massive, quite large. One of them's more global in their reach than the other. We live in a multipolar world, and it's getting more and more multipolar. That's often used as an excuse to say people are declining or going up, and it's just transitioning, okay? It's very rare a world being unipolar, and it's more a case of there was a lot of ego in that people believed that a unipolar world would exist forever. A unipolar world is the abnormal. A unipolar world is very unusual for Earth, for the human race. A unipolar means there's one major power who basically can therefore be the arbiter in everything. Now, we of course come from the Cold War period where everything was used as a bipolar world, but let's be honest, there was also China and there were various other factions which were major components of that. So, whilst it was preeminent powers bipolar, there was still a third power, and the world was still very much more complicated than maybe people would like to think on a simple reading of history. And if we go back further, it's usually even more complex. Well, at this period, you have three major powers. Now, you could say it's a unipolar world because, again, you've got Britain, which is the preeminent one, the primus inter pares, the first amongst equals, because of its naval strength, because of its empire, because of the way it had humbled Napoleon, because of the way it had financed everyone to fight Napoleon, and so everyone was still in debt to it and all those things. You can say that, but it's not a monopolar world. It's not a unipolar world. It's still a multipolar world. That's the more normal thing. And so, how do I put this politely? I suppose today, and this is a purely hypothetical, if Greece and Turkey, which are currently looking at each other meanly across various patches of water, actually started to have a fight. If Russia, China, and America jointly sent a task force, that's pretty much your equivalent option to try and bring about, to stop the war and deter the conflict continuing on. So the Ottoman Empire. Now, most of the times you will see them given this picture, this image, this flag. But it's only their official flag from 1844. It's around a bit earlier, but it's only the official flag from 1844. Their naval flag was this one. However, the fact is, some of the ships are pure Ottoman. Some of them are from the Ottoman Turkish vassals, sort of navy. And some of them are Ottoman Egyptian, from the Egyptian vassals. The navy of Egypt, the navy of, well, Muhammad Ali Pasha, Ibrahim's father. The Viceroy of Egypt, or Vali. The Ottoman Empire was not what it had once been. It was not ever what it had once been. It had been powerful under Selim the Magnificent and all the Suleiman the Magnificent and all the sort of other ones. It had been a powerful organization, but it had always been an organization structured more around providing an external enemy to unite its internal factions than necessarily a stable empire. And there are reasons for this. There are reasons for this in the structure. It built its an empire which comes about through conquest of the Byzantine Empire and various other parts. It's an empire which builds itself up by fighting, and it's structured around fighting, and it never is not fighting. It's always under seeing a siege mentality going on. And this means that you have decisions made which are questionable. One of the reasons why they have to call in the Egyptian troops and the Egyptian forces, which are being trained by the French, to back up the Ottomans, is because they have disbanded the Janissary Corps. They disbanded the Janissary Corps because, like the Praetorian Guard, it became too powerful. Praetorian Guard of Rome. The first establishment of the Janissary Corps had been that it would recruit basically babies, young boys, at most, from the northern parts of the empire. They'd be taken away as children. They'd be raised to become soldiers, and they would serve as soldiers. Their children could not follow them to Janissary Corps. Their sons could not inherit. They could marry and all these things, but their children could not become Janissaries. It was not a hereditary army. It was an ongoing, rejuvenating force who were only loyal to the Sultan and who owed their entire status to the Sultan as his Janissaries. However, over time, concessions have been won, including your children could become Janissaries. This changes things. This changes the nature of the corps. This changes its qualities. It also starts to become far more political as people start to think longer and longer term about how things will benefit them. And so we have this. We have this scenario. We have an empire which is crumbling from the inside and propped up from the outside. Edward Codrington, the Royal Navy officer in charge of the combined fleet, will actually get in trouble because of this. Because he fights the battle, he does too well, he wins too well, and he humbles the Ottomans too much. It makes them too weak versus the Russians. This is statecraft going on. And the Ottoman Empire, whilst one of the protagonists is not an actor in this debate, they are a supplicant, whether they like it or not. Especially, the Sultan has an opportunity. The Sultan could have decided, hang on, the British, the French, and the Russians are combining and are saying, don't do this. They are equal. Each of them is more powerful than me. I can't beat the Russians at the moment because I've just disbanded the entirely large chunk of my army, and I'm not finished rebuilding the next one that's going to replace it. Nowhere near ready. It'll be a decade before it's really up to standard, because the Janissary Corps have been so important to my army for so long. They have been the officers, they have been the generals, they have been every level of command, every level of importance for centuries. And I have got rid of them. So my army is critically weak at this point. And there is no way my navy can stand against the Russian navy yet. It's already had trouble. Let alone the French, and certainly not the British. So, should I withdraw to fight another day? Should I give the orders? Well, at this point, you can critique that Sultan because he doesn't. But you could also wonder whether he could, even if he had wanted to, give those orders. Because when it comes to Ibrahim, even orders from his father don't make him withdraw. It takes the combined pressure of the Royal Navy and the French army landing to enforce the orders from his father, and some very powerful officers of state coming from his father to remind the generals in the army below and remind me exactly who pays the bills. These are the three commanders you have for the British and the French and the Russians. We have, well, technically he's Dutch, but we'll leave that to one side. We'll get to him. Edward Corrington. Oh, good lord. You couldn't get someone more experienced if you tried from the Royal Navy. He did some of his education at Harrow School before he joined the Royal Navy. He served in the eastern seaboard in the United States, Mediterranean, home waters. Before he was even managed to make lieutenant in 1793. Lord Howe selected him to be signal lieutenant on the flagship of the Channel Fleet at the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars. And it was in this capacity he served on HMS Queen Charlotte, which was 100-gun first rate, during the operations at the glorious 1st of June. For his role in this battle, because he does very well as a signals lieutenant. Flag lieutenant, signals lieutenant are positions which can get you promoted very quickly if you do them well. If you do them well. I.e., if you're not Seymour. But, you know, so BT chose someone who was not qualified to do the role, and then the poor guy mucked up. He wasn't qualified or trained to do the role. And you poked him for where doing that role is the most critically important thing you can do. You pick Somerville. He's qualified and capable of doing it. After that, well, he did well. He attained post-captain in 1795 and got command of the Babette, which was a 22-gun vessel from which he observed the Battle of Groix. Then he was put in charge of the frigate HMS Druid, which, well, did well on prize money, but also, along with Doris the Unicorn, managed to capture the Ville de l'Orient, which was armed on flute, i.e. with minimal guns, because it was carrying 400 hussars to join the rebels in Ireland. This kind of got him a lot of attention. Then he went on half pay for a few years ashore, married Jane Hall, a lovely lady from Kingston, Jamaica, with whom he had 3 sons and 3 daughters, but remained without a ship until the Peace of Amiens came to a close in 1803. He does well. He does come from a family of a long military tradition, and, well, which has had quite a lot of different aristocratic roles. He also inherited, alongside his brother and sister jointly, their uncle's estates, which included a slave plantation in Antigua. When Napoleonic Wars began again, in earnest, well, he started off in frigates. But he was given a ship of the line in 1805. This was HMS Orion. And then he was called to Nelson. He was actually one of the officers who was asked for personally by Nelson. For the Battle of Trafalgar, he comes in at the rear. Takes 2 hours to reach the battle, because that's the way it goes. Once you're in line, you know, the battle started and you're going in 2 hours before you can start fighting back. He goes in and charges for the Swiftsure. She hadn't been up to engage up to that point. He forces her to surrender. He then decides he's going to try solo the Principe de Ostras because, you know, why not? She's got a 3-deck 112-gun ship and he's on a 74. You know, but he's British and he's Edward Codrington, so surely that makes up for the the missing of 38 guns? Surely! Anyway, they end up moving on to the Intrepid instead. The only ship of the Northern Division which managed to return from the French line, and Orion partnered with a couple of colleagues and smashed her 2 pieces. He then spent the next few years fighting alongside the Spanish against the French in the Mediterranean Sea. He commanded a couple of squadrons at different points that harried shipping, conducted coastal raids, took part in the Wild Cone expedition. He was also critical to the attempts to resupply Taronga when it was under siege, getting in troops and then evacuating people. And here is the thing which is the piece de resistance of his evacuation. So, he rescues 600 people from the beach under fire. Personally under fire. And then after he's got the people off, he makes it his personal mission to reunite the mothers and babies who've been separated during the evacuation and make sure the right child goes to the right mum. There aren't many admirals who would not go, I'm going to pass that one off. I can afford to. Nope. He decides it's on him. He's evacuated them. He's responsible for them. He will make sure this is done properly. He is an officer for whom personal responsibility is not just a phraseology or a watchword that you bandy around. He made Rear Admiral of the Blue in 1814. He served under Alexander Cochrane during the operations against Washington, Baltimore, and New Orleans during the War of 1812. And eventually he then made Rear Admiral the Red in August 1819, and then Vice Admiral in 1821. He was also elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in February 1822, which is why he is very well qualified and quite good to be the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet. He'd been appointed there in December 1826. He sailed for it in February 1827. And he was, well, how do I put this? Even when he was recalled, it took a while for his successor to turn out there, so he didn't come straight home. He stayed out in charge until his successor arrived. After the battle, as said, he will get into trouble, but I'll talk about that in a bit. Henry de Ringley was, well, how do I put this politely? He spent most of his Napoleonic wars fighting in the Grand Army and being a wonderful soldier. He also did some time in frigates. But he spent most of his time, in fact, pretty much all his time, either fighting alongside Napoleon or embedded with the Marines in the Guard, so did really well, or as the aide-de-camp to Marshal Bressiers. So when he starts saying things like he chose to command from frigates because the ship's line were in such bad state, just remember that the two very experienced naval commanders who were with him both agreed that, frankly, they didn't want him anywhere near their ships. Then we have possibly, well, there's a toss-up between Codrington and Van Hayden over who exactly is the more experienced naval officer. Both of them have been doing it for a long, long time, and both of them have had a lot of action. He joined the Dutch Navy at 9. He promoted to Lieutenant C at 16, so he'd made 7 years experience already. He went to the Dutch overseas territories about half a dozen times during this period. He was a faithful Orangist, accompanying William V on his flight to Schengen, from Schengen to England. And then he was locked up upon his return. He refused to give away any details of William's passage. He's set free, and then he resigns his commission and returns to Zutphen. And in 1795, Van Hayden, or Geerden, as he became known in Russia, offered his services to the Russian Emperor. He's appointed Captain and Lieutenant at sea at only 22, rises through the ranks incredibly quickly, operates in the Black Sea until 1803, gets promoted to Captain at sea second class, then gets married and, well, settles in Estonia. In 1808, he's promoted to Captain first class. He commands a Russian flotilla in Viborg in the war against Sweden. And then he defeats the Swedish galley fleet in the Battle of Sandstrom. He gets a lot of experience. He takes part in the siege of Danzig, where he's appointed a commodore. And he's decorated a lot. This is sometimes put down as a way of keeping him in the Russian ranks, but honestly, he doesn't really have anywhere he wants to go. When he does go back to the Netherlands after his service, he doesn't really like it. He's not used to it anymore. The Netherlands of now is not the Netherlands of his childhood and not the world he's used to now. He spent most of his life at sea and in Russian ships. He was the commander of the Russian squadron at the Battle of Navarino. And his victory there promoted him to Vice Admiral and more decorations. He is a very, very decorated officer and very experienced. He has commanded lots of different ships. Now, there is a debate as to which one of these has more experience doing inshore operations. His certainly has done quite a lot, but he did a lot in the operations in versus France, in Spain, etc. This guy doesn't really count. They kept him sandwiched between them. The theory was life couldn't go that much wrong as long as there was one of the experienced admirals was still in charge. So here's the British squadron. Asia, a second rate. Captain Edward Curzon, Commander Robert Lambert Baines as second in command as the XO and flagship of the British squadron. Genoa, a third rate 76 gun, Captain Walter Bathurst, Commander Richard Dixon. And Albion, a third rate 74, Captain John Ackworth Omery, Commander John Norman Campbell. Now, all these ships are pretty much twin deckers. Two main gun decks, they're PS4. Why? Because it's been found that the three deck ships are just not that stable, and these are the new generation of ships. In fact, technically, they are all supposed to be, broadly speaking, from the same sort of style of construction. Asia is brand new. She was launched at Bombay Dockyard in 1824. So she is one of the India-built ships, and she is very, very well built. Then you have Glasgow, a fifth rate, Cambrian, a fifth rate. They're James Ashley Maud's and Gowan William Hamilton's ships. Then we have Dartmouth, which is going to be quite an important vessel, because at several points Dartmouth is actually commanding everything, even when Celine, which has the French admiral in it, is the next to it. It's Dartmouth which is sending out the orders to all the smaller ships, because no one trusts the French admiral to actually give the orders. And that's Captain Thomas Fellows, who is Julian Fellows' many times great-grandfather. Yes, the guy who writes Downton Abbey, etc. He has this person in his history. If anyone deserves a TV program, it's got to be Thomas Fellows. Please. Please, someone, start a petition. Get Julian to write Thomas Fellows' TV story, history on TV. It would be amazing. It would be like, the people would be watching and going, but this can't be real. Seriously, Hornblower's made up. This must be made up, because this is more far-fetched than Hornblower, some of these stories. Yes! The reality exceeds Hornblower many times over. Captain Thomas Fellows, really cool character from history. Really interesting. Talbot, which was under the Captain Honourable Frederick Spencer. Rose, under Commander Lewis Davis. Brisk, under Commander Honourable William Anson. Mosquito, under Commander George Behan Martin. And Philomel, under Commander Henry Shetwood Talbot. Now, Hind, Cutter, 10. There are interesting questions here, because someone actually did put up, well, in the chat, a purser, and I sort of went, that looks like the name, possibly for the commander. the guy who's in charge. So that could have been correct. And there's also a lieutenant attached to them. And there's a reason for it. All names going around it. Hind is not actually a Royal Navy ship, but it's used as a Royal Navy ship. It's a revenue cutter. Yes, it's the equivalent of Coast Guard from its period. And I'm not sure why it's long there, because at the time, that time, the Royal Navy technically have two ships called Hind in their service. Which also makes up why it's quite so difficult to try and track down who's actually in charge of her. So she's a 10-gun ship, and the senior naval officer aboard might well have been her purser. It might have also been a lieutenant, because she might well have been under command of a revenue officer. But she's basically there because they need a lot of small ships. Why? Because the Ottoman fleet, and the Ottoman Egyptian Turkish fleet, has a lot of small ships in it. Oh, the French. Breslau, second rate. Captain Boffel de la Bretonnière. Scipion, third rate. Captain Pierre and Bernard Milhouse. Trident, third rate. 74. Captain Maurice. Now, they are decried by Deringny as being in such bad order that he didn't want to stay in charge of them, and therefore he chose the command from his frigate. There is also the point that there is an argument that none of the captains are prepared to serve under him, with him on their ship, because he didn't know how to sail anything bigger than a frigate. He'd never actually been in charge of anything bigger than a corvette. And there's also the point that their crews were not exactly keen on him. Remember, at this point, the French Navy is not that Napoleonist. So he's aboard his frigate, which is his normal flagship, the Serene, 60-gun frigate. Captain Robert in charge. Amédée, a second-rank frigate. Captain Huon, Alcyon, and the Captain Tepin, which no one's quite sure if it had 10 or 16 guns on it. It's interesting enough. French sources say 16. British and Russian sources say 10. Turkish sources say 16. Greek sources say 10. That I've read. So, take your pick. Normally, I would trust the French, because it's their own ship, and they should know. But, considering the report that's attached to comes from Derigny, who I find a interesting source, because he spends quite a lot of his time justifying why he was commanding from a frigate rather than one of the ships of the line, and trying to make it all about how bad they were, and covering up several of the facts, pertinent facts, which come out about that afterwards and beforehand. I'm not sure I trust him as a source. There's an interesting debate going on in academic history circles at the moment, which I'll just quickly delve into. It's about whether or not you teach students to use the word bias. Because apparently, if the fear is, if you teach them to use bias, then they will think there's such a thing as an unbiased source. No. Bias is not a digital 0 or 1. It's not a yes or no. Bias is a... Bias is a... It's a colour palette. Not even that. It's a scale of grey. Getting slowly darker and darker and darker. Never quite gets to anything other than grey, and never gets quite in either direction. Because there's always a bias. There's always a slight tint going on. in that grey. So I'm not quite sure where the idea comes from that if you teach students about bias, they will suddenly get the idea that there's such a thing as an unbiased source. There isn't. But I think that comes down to how you teach them about bias. When I teach students about bias, I teach them that, well, when I'm describing my glass, it's my glass. I like it. Now, I'd say this is clean. You might go, well, hang on, there's a slight orange tint to it because it said iron brew in it. Yeah. But to me, that's clean because there's iron brew going in there already, so it's clean. But that's my bias because I'm putting iron brew in there. If you wanted to put water in there, you'd have to go clean it. But am I lying? Is it not clean? No, it's clean, but it's by my reference it's clean. But that's references in my viewpoint, and my viewpoint, it has an implicit bias in it. And you can teach people its viewpoints or this, that, and the other, but it's far easier just to say, look, it's a bias. And that's a catch-all for a huge amount of things. There's bias in every source. But there is a difference with bias with prejudice and bias which is unintentional and bias which is perspective-based. And these are all part of the construction. And they're all part of the things you deconstruct when you're reading a source. So, when I'm reading Henry de Ringny's writings on these things, and I'm comparing it to the other admirals, there is part of me reading it going, well, de Ringny is a political animal, and he wants to become, and does end up becoming, head of the Navy. And basically naval secretary. Which is a very enriching post. But you don't get there by saying how well run the Navy is, do you? You get there by saying, there are all these problems, and I'm the person who will fix them. See? Bias. The Russian squadron under Rear Admiral Ludwig van Heyden. Gangat, second-rate, Captain Alexander Pavlovich Anivov. Azov, third-rate, Captain Mikhail Lazarev, flagship of the Russian squadron. And Lazarev goes on to having his own vast experience and career. Again, Haydn hasn't chosen the largest ship to be aboard as his flagship. There are two reasons for this. One, Lazarev is a preeminent captain and is really useful as a flag captain. Secondly, though, he decides that the Azov has a shallower draft and therefore can go further into the bay should he need it. Ezekiel, third rate, Captain Zivan. Alexander Nevsky, third rate, Captain Bagunach. Provony, Captain Efachin. Konstantin, Commander Khrushchev. Chef. Elena, Captain Epanchtin. And Castor, Captain Sitten. They're good ships. It's a good fleet. Now we come to the mess that is the Ottoman forces, because the trouble is you've got a theoretical person in charge, Amir Tahir, who doesn't get to be in charge much because Ibrahim Pasha is there, and frankly, well, how do I put this way? He doesn't really take notice of anyone. Really doesn't take notice of anyone. Ibrahim is a powerful general. He is a very effective general. But he is also, how do I put this politely? He doesn't have the gates, which you might expect a general to have. Even at this time, there are, let's be honest, we'd be comparing him to the likes of Wellington, that's Wellesley, and even Napoleon. And there are some things you just don't have your people do. Even at this time. But he'd also grown up fighting. He'd including fighting the British and for his alongside his father, fighting the Al Sauds. He has a lot of fighting experience, and that's affecting him. Now, theoretically, the flagship of the Commander-in-Chief is the Guen Rian, which is a second-rate 84. They're the Fatih Bahi, third-rate 74, also listed as a flagship, but we're not sure who's aboard her. The Burji Zephyr, third-rate 70. I've put 2 commas there to remind me that there is a debate as to whether she's 70 or 74 guns. There's also the fact that there is a debate with any ship below the first 2 as to whether or not they're carrying their full complement of guns. Because, well, sometimes people turned up without them. Now, the Egyptian ships we do know carried their full complement of guns, because the Egyptians had been fighting pretty much everyone. So the Egyptians are not carrying less than the full complement of guns. But we also know that the Ottoman and the Otto-Turkish ships are interesting. The Fez Nuzhat, a double-decked frigate with 64 guns. Qaid Zafar, double-decked frigate of 64 guns. Kawan Bari, double-decked frigate of 48 guns. Fez Mira, double-decked frigate of 48 guns. Mary Zafar, double-decked frigate of 48 guns. Wow, there's a lot of double-decked frigates going on here. And then you have the Guerriere, double-decked frigate, 60 guns. Egypt Islet, flagship of Moram Bay. In Shire, double-decked frigate, 64 guns, Egypt Islet. And again, the flagship of Hassan Bay. Even the Egyptian forces are divided into 2. Surya, double-deck frigate, 56. Leon, double-deck frigate, 60. And 10 further single-deck frigates and 30 corvettes and 28 brigs. So they have a far larger force in theoretical numbers of ships. And in theoretical numbers of guns. Theoretically, you are looking at a scenario where the Ottoman fleet has 78 ships with a combined total of 2,180 guns plus fireships, and the Allies have 22 ships with 1,258 guns. Which is the sort of thing which matters when you're talking in terms of newspaper articles. But as everyone who's a student of history knows, there is a difference. When you're talking about the Allies having ships which are crewed by veterans, which have large guns, larger guns, and are going to be faster firing because of those veterans, that's going to make a difference. Size of guns matters. Size of ship matters as well. Bigger ships tend to have thicker, sturdier hulls. A ship of the line's hull will be built very differently to a frigate. So, double-deck frigates might have the same number, almost the same number of guns as a third rate, but they are not going to have the same thickness of hull, they're not going to have the same strength. You're looking at ships which are in many ways the spiritual successors to the American heavy frigates, which are very capable vessels, but don't want to get in a fight with a ship of the line. Now, in their case, that's because they don't carry as many guns as a ship, even 64 guns, and so they really think, oh, but it's got 2 decks, like that ship has 2 decks, so maybe it can match in. And this is the only reason I can think of for the Sultan actually thinking he stands a chance. Because he just looked at it and went, that's 2 decks. Ooh. When actually what you've built is the equivalent of an Aegis sail battlecruiser. It's still a cruiser-built ship. It's built to sweep the seas of commerce. It's built to sweep the seas of other cruisers. It's built to protect your commerce as it sails around the world. It's built to be a status asset that you can deploy on distant posts. It's built to be a vessel which can go where you need it to go to give you the presence. But the ships of the line are your battleships. And you don't want to stick in a fight with those. As I've often said with a battle cruiser, the trouble is not the Battle of Jutland. Yes, they get lost there, but that's because they get stuck in a line because people are just adding in extra guns because they're obsessed with numbers of guns versus number of guns, as it's war is going to be mathematical when you don't need those guns and you could use those ships far more sensibly. The real problem for battlecruisers comes when you have the treaties, the Washington Treaty, etc., which lumps them together with battleships. Because you can build a battleship which is not going to be as fast as the battlecruiser you can build for the same tonnage, but is going to be able to beat the battlecruiser at the same tonnage in every single fight. Because it's built to be a battleship, it's built to do the fighting with battleships. A battlecruiser is still a cruiser. It's built to fight cruisers. Now, the Allies approached with two strategies. The British had already, in previous engagements with the Ottomans, managed to deter them from conflict and make them pause by using a show of force. And that seems to be going through Codrington's mind. Now, there are various depictions from people, especially discussing things after the event, and letters Codrington sent to his sister, who he seems to talk with a lot. Codrington is very open with his wife and his sister, and talks to pretty much all his family members. It's one of those things that sort of you sit there and go, he is engaging with them and he is expecting them to give an equivalent response. And they do. It's a very informed, very articulated family. It's a very ongoing discussion. Carried out by letters, but it's an ongoing, interesting discussion. This is not the sort of relationship where you are just calling up a family member and going, so how are the kids, da-da-da-da-da, and then putting the phone down and not talking for 6 months. No, this is an ongoing, what are these events going on at home? What are the events going on here? What are we deciding here? And one of the things Codrington thinks is that this battle is going to end up having to be fought. He doesn't know when this battle is going to be fought, but he does think that you can only deter for so long before eventually you are going to actually have to put up or shut up. He doesn't want to be the commander who does that. That's not what he's going in for. He's going in for a maximal display of power and bravasso. It's basically, it's going and going, go big and go in and go sort of, look how big, look how powerful we are. Do you really want to fight us? The Ottoman plan, which is come up with by Letellier, who's their senior French officer who's advising them, and who, along with the other French officers, will withdraw to the Austrian frigate, which is sitting in the bay, for safety, so they're not part of the battle and don't have to fight their fellow countrymen. And by the way, the Austrian frigate is sitting there supplying the Ottomans and supporting the Ottoman forces, because the Austrians are worried about the Russians coming in, and their view is that the best option to do that is to support the Ottomans, which the British and French probably did actually consider as well. They decided to go with creating a second buffer state in terms of Greece, which the Russians probably couldn't attack, and also stopping an ongoing sore which would be slowly eroding the Ottoman power and make them even less stable. Yeah, it's that level of realpolitik. So, when Codrington went into the bay, his the plan of the Ottomans was they were moored in a sort of horseshoe at the entrance of the bay, with the bigger ships in the first line, and then the ships getting the smaller and smaller ships, position to fire through the gaps. The idea was they'd mutually support and all that firepower would add up. But the trouble is then you're making the smallest cannon even further away from the action. And the thicker the wood is, it's going to sound strange again, but the small cannon fires, and it's firing at the lowest point on the hull where the wood is thickest on the ship of the line. It's probably not going to cause the most damage. Also, If all the ships are moored, then if you're shooting at their rigging and shooting their rigging away, that's great, but that's not going to really worry them as much, because they're mostly moving around by horsing hawsers on their anchors and basically using the ropes on their anchors to sort of move themselves so they can fire. They left. Codrington signalled the Allied fleet when he went in. Prepare for action. Now, this is can be taken as two ways. It can be taken as he thinks war's going to come and he thinks the fight's going to happen, or he's being sensible, because if you don't prepare for action and you're sailing right into the mouth of the enemy fleet, then you could get all your people killed. You can prepare for action without actually having to fire anything. Gun ports were left half open, not fully open. And the Allied captains were under strict orders to fire only if attacked. Only open fire if you're attacked. So, Codrington leads the way in with Asia. The British were followed by the French line, which is slightly to starboard, closest to Navarino, and the Russians to port slightly behind the French, but not much. It's basically a case of the British and the French and the Russians. At which point they get a message from Ibrahim Pasha, which states that he had not given permission for the Allies to enter the bay, demanded they withdraw. Codrington dismissed it. He replied that he'd come to give orders, not to take them. Which is a fairly aggressive stance, but they are there to try and stop the ongoing prosecution of the war and forced withdrawal of the Egyptian and the Ottoman forces from the Peloponnese. That's not going to happen by agreeing to their demands, because they don't want to go anywhere. So it's a show of force. And it's a show of force in a come on if you think you're hard enough style. He furthermore warned that if the Ottomans opened fire, their fleet would be destroyed. Very much bravado going on here. He anchored his flagship in the middle of the Ottoman line, and then ordered a brass band to play on the deck to emphasise his peaceful intentions, is one perspective. There are several perspectives given, but it certainly would probably reassured the crews. And it also has an impact of, again, showing his confidence. I have people playing music on my decks. I'm so confident you won't do anything. I'm so confident you notice that doing something would actually be very, very bad. And let's consider this from perspective. If Codrington's fleet had been destroyed, if the French, the British, and the Russian ships had been destroyed by the Ottomans, that would have been terrible. There would have been a terrible loss of life. But the fleets which would have been mobilised to come against them after that would have left no Ottomans standing. This is the thing which Ibrahim and, to an extent, the Sultan might not have much choice because his commanders don't seem to be taking any notice of him. Ibrahim doesn't seem to be thinking about. And yes, he had been part of a force which had defeated the British Army, but Ibrahim is also very well read. He has studied it. He's kept up to date with events. He knows how powerful the British are. If the British lose, if the French lose, if the Russians lose, they will have to come back to reinforce their honour and their global standing. So they will come back with masses of force. They have sent token fleets. There are 4 ships of the line from the Russians, 3 from the British and 3 from the French. As they're not fighting each other, probably the British and the French and the Russians could have each afforded to send 30 ships of the line. They could have filled that bay with wooden walls. And that's probably what would have come if they'd lost. As the Allied vessels were moving into position, the Ottoman lines, well, had trumpets sounding. And it was action stations. The Ottoman crews scrambling, they were worried, they were dealing with things. And it's at this point fighting breaks out. Now, the fighting breaks out around Captain Thomas Fellows. His frigate, Dartmouth, had been detailed with 6 small vessels, that's 2 brigs and 4 schooners, to keep watch on the Ottoman corvettes and fireships on the left flank of the Ottoman line. As they moved into the bay, Fellows had his Fellows' various lookouts noticed and brought to his attention that a fireship was being prepared by its crew, and so sent a boat to instruct them to desist. The Ottomans fired on the boat and lighted the fireship. Fellows sent a cutter, I think possibly the Hind, to tow the fireship to a safe distance. But the Ottomans then fired on the cutter, which inflicted casualties. At this point, HMS Dartmouth, Fellows' ship, opens musket fire on the fireship crew to cover his men. And Serene joins in. That's the French flagship. An Ottoman corvette then decides that it's going to fire its actual cannon at Serene. This leads to Dartmouth firing its cannon at the Ottoman corvette, because the Serene is taking its time doing it, and frankly the corvette's starting to annoy it. And so the battle begins. Coming just behind the Serene was the Scipion, which has, of course, 80 guns. And it came under attack by Egyptian frigates on both sides, and shore batteries, and a fireship. The latter was dealt with by Dartmouth and Hind and another British boat pulling it clear. And, well, how do I put this politely? Here, this is my argument about the quality of the crews, etc., and the quality of the ships. At one point, the fireship, which was pulled off successfully, jammed itself under Scipion's bowsprit. Sorry. The foresails caught on fire, and the fire spreads to the upper gun deck. And the crew actually flung themselves on the fire to prevent it spreading to the forward powder magazine. This leads to horrendous injuries. Burn injuries which you really do not want to think about. And whilst this is going on, the gunners continue to fire on their attackers. Trident, her sister, and of course Dartmouth, as mentioned, provide cover, get tow lines in, and then the 2 British boats, 2 cutters, Hind probably one of them, pull it clear. A crew which is badly organised, not well trained, not well motivated, do not chuck themselves on a fire to save their ship. They don't. They chuck themselves off into the water. So sorry, that's just one of the reasons why I don't like Dering's account of the battle and his, I'm not on the big ships, the ships of the line, because they are not properly fitted out, and the crews aren't up to stand, and they don't, that's as close as you get to slander in my mind. In fact, that is slander, but we'll leave that to one side. Serene carried on fighting a duel with the frigate Ishana, which finally blew up and caused casualties and damage actually to Serene when she did it. However, then with the support of Trident and Scipion still firing, bombarded the fort of Navarino to the extent that they silenced this shore battery. the shore battery, which was supposed to be the deciding factor in entrance to the bay, got silenced by 2 ships of the line and a frigate, which had already been through blowing up, and one of those ships of the line had already been burnt. And, yeah, they silenced it. Breslaw, under Bretonnier, who doesn't seem to be de Rigny's biggest fan, decides that he doesn't need any further support, and so breaks away from the French formation and goes to join the British and Russian lines, specifically to reinforce Albion and Azov, which were both hard pressed, and frankly he preferred their captains. Albion had already by this point managed to wreck an Ottoman frigate as she anchored, and was taking fire from 3 Ottoman ships of the line simultaneously. Now, this would normally be a very short and sharp and painful experience for any ship to be under, but in the reality, their accuracy was terrible. Anyone would think they'd been trained by French gunners. They had been. I'm sorry, but the French... This is going to sound strange, but the French gunnery is good on their ships, but they have a habit, it seems, whenever they're training a foreign power in gunnery in this period, the gunnery of those ships which they train are terrible. No one knows why. Every single time you send, if they get British or Dutch to come train them in gunnery, their accuracy will be great and they'll be up to an equivalent power. Send a French one. The gunnery gets fast, it gets well understood, it doesn't get accurate. Even so, and I do love the way that phrase appears in so many different accounts of the battle, that I think it's actually part of the original documentation, but I haven't been able to get the original documentation, which I think it might come from, to actually read. The Breslaw gets not only acknowledged by the captain of Albion as having saved his ship, but also gets sent several cases of alcohol as a thank you. Breslaw, well, Bretonnier really, because he's the captain, then decides that, frankly, he's going to take on Tahir Pasha's flagship, the Giraran, and 4 frigates, pretty much simultaneously, and destroys them all. Asia, which was next to Captain Bey's flagship, the Fatih Bari, and Maram Bey's flagship, the Guerriere, well, found himself in an interesting situation where, whilst Fatih Bari opened fire, Maram Bey said that he was not going to attack. Same word. So, Asia concentrated all its fire on one side, going boom, boom, boom. And once they pretty much silent Fatih Bari, and it was in a poor condition in the beginning place, Codrington sends an interpreter to go and chat with Moram Bey to find out what's going on. But his interpreter is shot, dead, as he attempts to board. At which point, Guerriere opens fire, which suggests there's been a change in leadership aboard the frigate. However, she's now, by this point, she gets broadsides from both Asia and Azov. So, 60-gun frigate, dealing with 2 very large vessels, both equally confused. If we are quite sure about this, one is, of course, an 80-gun third rate, and one is an 84-gun second rate. So, let's see, broadsides from both, that's 40 and 42 guns respectively. So that's 82 guns firing, and she's only got, well, she could probably be responding with about 30 guns because of the way she's anchored. So, yeah, that's painful. That is very, very painful. And that was not the good decision to make, to change. If you're going to start firing, fire earlier when you had a chance, and theoretically you had Fatty Barry, at least as a sop to take the attention away from you. But no, she didn't open fire till they were finished. Asia then starts to suffer casualties and damage from the second and third lines of the Ottoman formation, which was what, of course, Letellier, the French captain who'd been advising the Ottomans, had planned. So that causes issues, but it's also, there's a bit of a debate about it, because Codrington actually thinks he's hit more by Genoa, which was one of his other ships, and technically a sister of Asia, than the small ships from further away. He has words. He has words. The captain of Genoa does not necessarily enjoy those words afterwards. In fact, possibly Bathurst had a small sort of come to Jesus moment with Codrington for shooting at him. I should not be laughing so much. I shouldn't, but it's just, the whole thing is, and then it got worse, and then it got worse for the Ottomans. Van Hayden was actually the last to take up station. This was as planned. And he took up station at the right end of the Ottoman crescent, which was the most exposed. Azov sinks, disables 3 large frigates, a corvette, takes several hits below the waterline out of the 153 hits she takes, but also possibly smashes a fair number of other things as well. She seems to only count things that she's certain she killed, but she seems to be firing a lot. And, well, after the first line has been pretty much annihilated, and with the ship's line providing support, Dartmouth, in overall charge of the small ships, decides to, how do I put this? Charge into the melee and get up close and personal with the remaining small ships, which then get blasted to pieces. So, by 4 p.m. that day, all the Ottoman ships' line, all the large frigates of the first line had been dispatched. Codrington actually twice tries to order ceasefire during what comes next. Either his signals are invisible or ignored. And by 6 o'clock, the Ottoman fleet, which their bravery is actually praised by Codrington and Van Heyden, 3/4 were sunk, many of them dismasted, blown up or set on fire by their own crews to prevent them going into Allied hands, and this leads to the numbers of deaths. The fact is that there were considered that some personnel were actually shackled to their posts in the Ottoman ships, which is not going to make for a good sailing ship. Codrington got his casualty figures from Letellier, the French advisor to the Ottoman fleet, and it was approximately 3,000 killed, 1,100 wounded. Codrington felt it was more likely the reverse, but considering, those numbers were flipped around, but considering the Armada had began of 78 vessels in this Ottoman, Turkish, Ottoman, and Ottoman Egyptian fleet, 8 remained seaworthy. A dismasted ship of the line, 2 frigates, and 5 corvettes. Allied casualties were 181 killed, 480 wounded, including Midshipman H. Codrington, who was serving on Asia with his father, badly injured, but made a full recovery. He's the youngest son. If he'd gone back without him, I'm fairly sure his wife would have been very upset. And I don't mean that as I don't mean that as a joke. I mean that Jane was a very, very good mum. Again, this is something you get from the letters going back and forth. Doesn't quite say in a letter that, you have got the youngest with you. If anything happens to him, I will hold you responsible for it. But there is definitely a tone of, you are looking after our youngest, aren't you, in those letters. And I should please state from the letters that I haven't. There are authors and historians who have read the full set of letters. I have read excerpts of letters, and I have read the books written from those letters. So I'm giving my impression from what I've seen. So, aftermath. What is the aftermath? Well, Codrington gets into trouble because he then goes to he then goes to Egypt to press for withdrawal of Ibrahim. He manages to get the withdrawal from Ibrahim, but the actual battle is called by King George IV an untoward event. It's undesirable. It's not wanted. And the reason it's not wanted is because it really weakens the Ottomans. And then there's Wellington himself becomes Prime Minister again, 1828 to 1830. His popularity meant that the initial disapproval had to be kind of restrained. But he was removed from the Mediterranean fleet by Wellington when it was considered time, and he was only given the Grand Cross of the Bath. They refused to pay his crews their prize money from the sale of captured Ottoman treasures and goods. The other commanders go home to victories and are saluted, and as mentioned, one goes home to become governor of Kronstadt, that's Van Heyden, and Daringi goes home to become Secretary of Navy and rise in status. Codrington goes home to not disgrace, because he's loved by his sailors and he'd won a victory. But it wasn't the kind of victory the British wanted. The British wanted a Collingwood. They wanted someone who would be able to defuse the situation with a stare. There is often the discussion about the British public and the government wanting another Trafalgar, and how the Royal Navy can't deliver it because Trafalgars are very rare. This is actually pretty much another Trafalgar. It's complete annihilation of the enemy fleet. It's Trafalgar. It's done in the Nelsonian style. Although Codrington will not consider himself a Nelson come again. He'd served with Nelson. He was not Nelson. But what you're dealing with is they don't want Nelson. They want Nelson in wartime. But this isn't war. This is deterrence. They want Collingwood. They want the admiral who they politically charged period, arguably, of British politics up till the current day, where it was the most partisan it's arguably ever been up until now. They were prepared to leave Collingwood in charge no matter who was in power because he was so good at his job. They wanted a Collingwood. They wanted someone who would cause Ibrahim and all the others to back down just with a raised eyebrow and a look and going, really? The trouble was, you can't just be Collingwood. And it's one of the problems we have to this day. when we're doing diplomacy, when we're doing naval deterrence, and all these sort of operations, one of the things you have to factor in is that when we're looking at this period for inspiration, you also have to consider the officers of this period. Codrington had fought in many great battles. He'd been a captain of a ship of the line at Trafalgar. He then commanded in operations, led squadrons in the Mediterranean, in the latter part of the Napoleonic Wars. He knew what he was doing. He was a noted commander. It still wasn't enough. That wasn't enough of an image. That wasn't enough status that he could force things just by raising an eyebrow. When he went and had to talk to Ibrahim Pasha to get him to withdraw, when he was doing his best, and it worked for a while, but when Ibrahim Pasha saw that the Greeks weren't taking any notice, or rather the Greek commanders weren't taking any notice of their own government, then he felt he no longer had to be bound by it. At which point, they fight this battle. And Codrington has to go to Ali Pasha in Egypt, Ibrahim's father, and get him to order Ibrahim's withdrawal. And facilitate that. With some not undue threats to Alexandria, etc. Not actually said, but very forceful gunboat. Look how big my guns are. Diplomacy. It works. It delivers on the mission. It provides peace in Greece. But that wasn't what the British had sent him out for. The British hadn't sent him out to support peace in Greece. This is the point of why it's a controversy. If the British had been sending out Codrington to secure peace in Greece, then he's done it perfectly. But they weren't sending out for peace in Greece. They're sending him out to make sure the Russians didn't get power in Greece. And they wanted to do that by having their cake and eating it. They wanted the Ottomans out of Egypt, out of Greece, and they wanted the Ottoman fleet and forces intact so they could fight the Russians. Collingwood probably could have achieved that. But Collingwood was dead by this point. And there was no other like him. We were blessed, Britain, in the early 19th century in having one of the best warfighting admirals the world has ever seen. And having one of the best conflict management admirals the world has ever seen. In quick succession. And they were friends and operated next to each other. That is rare. But the fact is, one could do it because of the other. Because of the status, the eminence he'd built up, fighting alongside, being in every single battle, doing all those things together, had meant that he had the power. No one wanted to fight him. That was the thing. No one wanted to fight him because he was one of those admirals who you weren't sure if he just had a little frigate and you had an entire fleet. You were still not sure whether you were going to bet on your fleet. And that's rare. And that's deterrence. That's status. And that's the trouble for Codrington. He's not Collingwood. And that's why there is the controversy afterwards. And yes, I would argue the Battle of Navarino is critical to the Greek independence. Because if once you've destroyed the Ottoman, Turkish, Egyptian fleet, they can't reinforce. And then when the French land an expeditionary force, primarily to stop the Russians landing an expeditionary force, the army evacuates. And when the army is evacuated, Greece has its independence. And we have the founding of modern Greece. Navarino is important. But Codrington's failure is he's not Collingwood. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your support. I always end these with questions. And so I'm going to end this with a question. I want you to think through history. I want you to think about history, and I want you to think in other scenarios where the thing that's the shifting stone is the eminence of the person saying it. I.e., if one person says something, it's going to cause peace. It's going to cause the opponent to back down. And doesn't matter how similar the circumstances, but in another situation, someone else saying it just won't have the same impact. Collingwood's raised their eyebrow. Causes armies to go, woo. Codrington just can't do that. He doesn't have that image. So I wanted to think about it, where image is the deciding factor in making people back down or fight. And thank you again for all your support. I couldn't do anything with all this without you. I really couldn't. You know, this whole system here is thanks to all of you, so thank you. And all the research I'm going off to be doing at the end of this year, it's all thanks to you, and all the work I'm doing at the moment is really thanks to all of you and your support, so thank you very much. Thank you for the comments. The comments really do matter. I really enjoy reading them, and I love doing the comment response videos. Thank you for all... and this is going to sound strange. Thank you for all the chocolate. Thank you for... that's always fun. And the Iron Brew themed things which keep appearing. Thank you. Thank you for the super chats, the super thanks, the memberships on the channel. Thank you for the patrons. Thank you everything, because those are really, really helpful. I don't like to get into too much detail, but they are really helpful. So thank you. All this would not be possible without you, so thank you very much. Take care, and hope you enjoyed. And hope to see you next time. We've got, well, the active class on Tuesday. And then next, the following, first of November, it's going to be the Battle of Coronel. And on Thursday, it's Patron 65, Shortcomings with the designs of early aircraft carriers. That's going to be fun. Enjoy. Thank you very much. Take care.